Well, good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Conrad Gorlinski, and this is the news. Well, the top story today is, of course, the situation in and around Ukraine. Boris Johnson this afternoon spoke very matter-of-factly when addressing Russia's intensified military maneuvers and its potential invasion. Meanwhile, recordings of the first instances of Ukrainian people and independent foreign media representatives coming under military fire have been released.
Johnson used stark language during the second day of the annual International Security Conference in Munich. He underlined that the effect of a Russian invasion would be the destruction of the Ukrainian democratic state. Boris Johnson spoke about a ban on access to London's capital markets for Russia.
And if Russia invades its neighbor, we will sanction Russian individuals and companies of strategic importance to the Russian state. And we will make it impossible for them to raise finance on the London capital markets.
The UK Prime Minister also addressed NATO's response to Russian actions should the invasion go forward.
It's clear to Putin that if he thinks that by doing this he can kind of push NATO back, then he's wrong. What he's going to get is not less NATO, it's more NATO.
Johnson also summed up all of his country's direct involvement in supporting Ukraine militarily and otherwise. In the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, video has been captured of shelling directed at Ukrainian soldiers and foreign media staff. Ukraine is blaming Russian separatists for the attacks, while Russia is blaming Ukraine. Saturday's Munich Security Conference was mostly devoted to resolving the growing tensions in Eastern Europe.
Today marks the 8th anniversary of the tragic events that took place during the so-called Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. Militia and Berkut troops brutally crushed protests in Kiev's Independence Square. At the end of 2013, protests in the Maidan began, during which over 100 protesters were killed.
On November 21, 2013, due to the failure to sign an association agreement with the European Union by the past president Viktor Yanukovych, protests broke out on Independence Square in Kiev, which were later referred to as the Euromaidan.
See how many people here, and everybody want to live in European country. And we want to say to this government, to this president, if he doesn't listen to us, we're doing everything. Is a new president, a new government. We will be listening people.
The first attempt to suppress the demonstration took place on November 30th, 2013. A brutally carried out action by Special Forces Berkut led to mass movement and protests. At the height of the protests, nearly 800,000 people were in the Independence Square in Kiev. When the authorities of Yanukovych began to make a number of mistakes, including the violent dispersal of the protests, after a few days, at the end of November 2013, these protests grew very quickly, and they became even more numerous. The authorities tried again to suppress them by force. This caused even greater social resistance. The repeated attempts by Viktor Yanukovych and the pro-Russian Party of Regions to suppress the demonstrations in the period from the 18th to 20th of February 2014 were of the most brutal nature. Nearly 100 people died. The resistance was crazy. The resistance was bloody. Internal forces controlled from Moscow led to the dispersal of these peaceful demonstrations, to the shedding of blood. Ukraine did not give up. Ukraine won this fight, despite huge losses. On February 21st, the militia left the streets of Kiev and with it Yanukovych, who fled to Russia. The result of the speeches was, among others, the restoration of the 2004 constitution and release of Yulia Tymoshenko from prison. The Euromaidan resulted in an increase in separatist tendencies in regions largely inhabited by Russians that were inspired by the Kremlin. The Ukrainian Euromaidan in Kiev, the capital, is an unprecedented event. It is actually an anti-communist counter-revolution. This is what we can call it, an attempt by Ukrainians to regain freedom and independence after many, many years. In April 2014, Russia launched a hybrid aggression against Ukraine, destabilizing Donbass and Luhansk. These actions were preceded by the annexation of Crimea by Russian soldiers.
On Thursday, Donald Tusk organized a conference attended by former presidents, defense ministers, and commanders of the Polish army and intelligence services who served under his rule. The aim was to discuss Poland's national security, but one could get the impression that the initiative was supposed to lead to the creation of a second, oppositional cabinet council. At the beginning of the meeting, the chairman of the Civic Platform, Donald Tusk, emphasized that he had previously talked with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and the head of the European Council, Charles Michel.
Każdy z moich rozmówców
Each of my interlocutors admits, and it's hardly surprising. They say that every scenario is to be expected in their assessment. No events can be ruled out, although a full-scale invasion today seems less likely than even a few days ago.
niż jeszcze kilka dni temu.
The meeting was attended by former presidents Bronisław Komorowski and Aleksander Kwaśniewski, Senate Marshal Tomasz Grodzki, former heads of defense ministries under Donald Tusk, Bogdan Klich, and Tomasz Siemoniak. Rafał Ziemkiewicz believes that despite the current problems of the ruling camp, there is no alternative to the opposition. This was a meeting of some fantastic zombies that Donald Tusk organized. It was a fantastic show, demonstrating that we are here for a nostalgic party, a return to the good old days when Kwaśniewski and Michnik were the arbiters of elegance and ruled everything, and the newspaper Gazeta Wyborcza imposed the tone. On the other hand, many were shocked by Senate Marshal Tomasz Grodzki's trip to Miami for the 60 Million Congress, i.e. the global congress of the Polish diaspora. Photos from the trip were widely shared. According to reports from the Wprost Weekly, he was criticized, even by members of the Civic Platform, and Donald Tusk himself was said to be furious. Marshal Grodzki realized that this was his first and last term in office at such a high position, as the third person in the country, and he's using it as much as he can. The Marshal's visit to Kiev a few days later was meant to improve his image. In my opinion, he wanted to balance this trip to Miami to compensate for the absurdity that came with it in a situation of a threat to peace in Europe. Tomasz Sakiewicz reminds that there had already been an opportunity to go to Ukraine 2 days earlier, and this was with a delegation from the Polish parliament. Show unity and don't save your image by quickly leaving for Ukraine, because it shows Ukrainians that we treat them instrumentally. Marshal Grodzki is planning a trip to Dubai, but according to Onet's reports, his party colleagues are trying to persuade him to reduce his delegation. And finally, yesterday, using emergency powers, which were not voted on in the House, Canadian police, on Justin Trudeau's orders, used pepper spray and stun grenades in a final push to clear the capital of trucks and demonstrators who've been occupying the downtown core of Ottawa for more than 3 weeks in protest against the now redundant pandemic restrictions. After clearing a portion of the blockade and making more than 100 arrests on Friday, 47 more arrests were made on Saturday morning, as police moved quickly to disperse the main portion of the blockade in front of Parliament and the Prime Minister's office. The police claimed that some of those arrested on Saturday wore body armor and had smoke grenades and other fireworks in their bags and vehicles. Many videos, however, are circulating online of police dressed in full military tactical gear and armed with AR-15 rifles, smashing truckers' windows and forcefully removing them from their vehicles.
It's totalitarian tyranny. Like, I don't even know what to say. The fact that this hasn't even been voted on in Parliament for these Emergencies Act is insane.
They're coming in. They're coming in, guys. Grab her, guys. We gotta move.
Police claimed that some loud bangs of stun grenades were heard. People were sprayed with a chemical irritant in an effort to stop the assaultive behavior and for officers' safety. Later, however, the police claimed that no tear gas had been used. Ottawa's interim police chief has vowed to continue investigating all the protesters to charge them.
If you are involved in this protest, we will actively look to identify you and follow up with financial sanctions and criminal charges. Absolutely. This investigation will go on for months to come.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Monday invoked emergency powers to give his government wider authority to stop the protests. He authorized banks and financial institutions to temporarily freeze the accounts of those suspected of supporting the blockades without obtaining a court order. The situation in Canada has even prompted some lawyers in the U.S. to offer their services for Canadians who would like to request political asylum, as their situation meets all the characteristics required to make such a claim in the United States. Debate in Parliament over the emergency powers resumed on Saturday, and a final vote is scheduled for Monday. Trudeau's Liberals and opposition New Democrats have indicated their support, which should ensure its passage. Thanks for joining us this evening. Please stay with us for Poland Daily Weather, Poland Daily Business, and other programs. But from me, it's have a wonderful week ahead.